Hi, I'm Fergal Leonard of Bristol Central Library, and I'm here with Mark Steeds of the Long John Silver Trust and the Bristol Radical History Group. Mark's been working to put together an exhibit at Bristol Central Library on Gulliver's travels. Thanks for joining us, Mark, to talk about your exhibit and why you decided to do it with us. And it's a really interesting exhibit. We're hoping lots of people are going to enjoy it.
Absolute pleasure, Fergal. It's great to be here.
So, why now? What is it about this moment that you decided to do this exhibit with us on Gulliver's Travels?
Well, it's 300 years since the book's publication, and it seems to be going unnoticed in Ireland, where you'd think they'd be doing a lot about it. Mm-hmm. It's sort of under the carpet, under the radar. We think it's really relevant because it covers a period in history, in Bristol's history, which is really under investigated. And also, the book is so relevant to today with all sorts of things that are going on in the present climate.
Yeah, so a lot of people, myself included, might primarily associate Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift as a sort of children's book, a story, a fanciful tale. But when you actually start looking into it, it's a really biting satire of contemporary politics, colonialism. Is that something you want to talk a little bit more about?
Yes, I'd love to. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, along with other books that we've also covered in the library before, like Treasure Island, which is partially set in Bristol, and Robinson Crusoe. We did 300 years of that as well back in 2019 in the library. They're all relevant today, really, with Bristol's backdrop is pirating and privateering backdrop during the War of the Spanish Succession, which really led up to the writing of Gulliver's Travels. All that sort of thing bring it forward 300 years, and here we are again. There's wars going on left, right in Chelsea. There's a lot of corruption within politics. There's a lot of everything that Swift was in the centre of is still relevant today.
Yeah, that's one thing that comes across really clearly in your exhibit with the items that you on display is the colonial context that Jonathan Swift was writing in, this period of British expansion around the globe. You bring up the South Sea Company, the South Sea Bubble it's most famous for, as a vastly inflated firm that went under and took a lot of people with it, and their role in the British involvement in the trade of enslaved people in the Americas. So all of these things you're saying came into Jonathan Swift's mind as he was writing Gulliver's Travels, and you've got to understand it in that context.
Yeah, well, definitely. And Swift is interesting because he was, with his great wit and writing capabilities, he was used and abused, if you like, by the powers that be. So the Tories at that time, led by a chap called Bolingbroke, Viscount Bolingbroke, his real name Henry St. John, and Robert Harley, first Earl of Oxford, they used Swift and his sort of enemy, if you like, Daniel Defoe as well, to put out pamphlets and everything, attacking the then ruling Whig administration. And it was really interesting because the Spanish War of Succession, it went from 1702 to 1714, it was being financed by the Bank of England, which was ruled by the Whigs. And they were sort of, via that method, they were controlling what went into the armies and all that sort of stuff, finance-wise. So the Tories were looking for another means to finance the war without bothering the Whigs, if you like. And they set upon the idea of the asiento, using the asiento, which was a contract to supply enslaved people to the Spanish Americas, and after Bristol Bishop Robinson managed to secure that at the Treaty of Utrecht, that meant that they had a commodity, if you like, to form the backbone of the South Sea Company. So they got that contract for 30 years, and thousands of people were sent across the seas off the back of it. And it propelled, this is what's really important, it propelled Britain into the #1 slave trading nation in the world.
And Bristol with a very central role in that. You mentioned a Bristol bishop being involved in securing the asiento. How does Bristol fit into this picture?
Well, Bristol's merchant venturers had gained access to the slave trade in the first instance in 1698 by petitioning Parliament and breaking the Royal African Company monopoly. With that, all of a sudden, there was a huge uplift in Bristol's economy. It expanded greatly, and off the back of that, then the whole city expanded greatly. That sort of set the scene for Bristol to ultimately eclipse London as the #1 slave trading port in Britain, and then ultimately Bristol lost that position to Liverpool in the 1740s. So from the 1720s to the 1740s, you could say that Bristol was the #1 slave trading port in the world.
And how does Jonathan Swift fit into this? What was his position, as far as we know, on this rapid expansion in British involvement in enslaving people around the world?
He was a bit conflicted because he helped bring this about. He was primarily interested in getting the peace, but his great friend Alexander Pope, he saw through the Asiento immediately and wrote one of the first anti-slavery tracts against the slave trade then. And then when Swift had a little bit more time in the 1720s, he was able to reflect upon that, and via the means of Gulliver's travels, he was able to make Gulliver put his point of view across in terms of, is colonial expansion really that good a thing? What are you doing to these people abroad? And it was really hard hitting once he started going on that. And we reflected that in one of the panels, that Gulliver's prediction, we call it. And we've used another writer, Robert Louis Stevenson, in his experiences in Samoa to look back on what Swift's prediction was,
Yeah, so we've got this moment right at the start, in some ways, of this, almost Bristol-centric, in some senses, expansion. And then, as you say, you bring in Robert Louis Stevenson, another writer with Bristol literary connections, Long John Silver famously being a Bristolian, and his expedition launching from Bristol.
Pub landlord, no less, with a spy glass.
Just as Gulliver himself departs from Bristol, some century and a half before. So you've managed to sort of bring it all round in a really interesting way.
We looked at Swift's history, and he actually was a chaplain to the second Earl of Berkeley. And when Berkeley got the role of Chief Justice of Ireland, one of 3 roles there, he actually set sail from Bristol to Dublin, and that was in August 1699, and Swift was able to reflect that in his sort of semi-biographical Gulliver's guise, as setting sail from Bristol in May 1699 aboard the Antelope, and that is where the huge connection comes about, really.
Yeah. Could you talk a bit more about the Irish context then? Jonathan Swift obviously going to Ireland. You say Gulliver's Travels in that regard is very autobiographical. Are there elements of Gulliver's Travels that you think speak to Swift's, what he's seeing is happening in Ireland in this time?
Oh, definitely, absolutely. Well, Bristol's connections with Ireland go right back over 1,000 years when enslaved people locally were being shipped off from Bristol to Dublin to feed the then sort of Viking slave trade, going way back. Bristol managed to get the slave trade banned via St. Wolfston in 1090. So this was the trade between Bristol and Dublin. And it died out for quite a few years until Bristol found itself at the centre of the anarchy, which was when Queen Matilda was supposed to take the throne, and she was usurped by her cousin, King Stephen, leading to 15 years of bitter war centred on Bristol Castle. When that ended, by negotiation, Henry II, Matilda's son, took over from Stephen after he passed away. That ended, but the slave trade had kicked off again during that period because there was very little governance. And Henry II saw that, and he used it as a partial excuse to invade Ireland in 1171. So that's when you got your de facto relationship between Bristol and Ireland then. He actually populated Dublin with Bristol merchants who ended up being massacred in Killeen Woods just outside. And that was all covered by a brilliant book in the library by Derek Robinson called A Shocking History of Bristol. And we put that in the cabinets as well to show the relationship again between Bristol and Ireland. And again, Bristol merchants used the situation in Ireland regarding the the rebellion of 1641 of the three kingdoms, Ireland, England and Scotland, and prisoners of war being presented to Bristol merchants to ship off and help colonise the West Indies and all that sort of stuff. So all this is embellished into Bristol's past. It's amazing, really.
And Swift is drawing on a long history of exploitation and colonialism, of which Bristol played an important part from the very start.
He's been misread sometimes, but he even though he was proud to be English and he liked his Englishness, he was for the Irish people in many, many ways. For instance, he wanted Queen Anne's bounty to be extended from the poor clergy of England to the poor clergy of Ireland, but he was prevented from doing that, which is why he went over to the Tories. There was another thing, when England unified with Scotland, the Kingdom of Ireland was diminished in importance and its economy suffered, and he was right in the centre of trying to flag that up and trying to get Ireland on an equal footing, which hitherto it had been.
And do you think this is reflected in Gulliver's Travels?
Definitely, yeah. He percolated everything, all his life experiences into it, and it's in 4 parts. And we were on about children's literature earlier. The 4 parts he wrote about are quite involved, with different aspects of the yahoos and people like that. And then when you read the children's version, it's really dumbed down. You know, Gulliver gets a new suit, or Gulliver tows the fleet, or stuff like that. But we show that in the cabinets around the library. We're so lucky that we got such a resource here in Bristol.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've mentioned a few items that you've taken from our collections and included in the display. Could you expand on that? Did you find anything particularly interesting when you were looking at the items we have at here at Bristol Central Library?
Yeah, definitely. You've got really early versions of lots of books, Gulliver's Travels in particular, but also you've got documents from the Breckenridge collection, for instance. And we were talking about the Bristol bishop involved with the Asiento. Well, his runic inscription, because he was a chaplain, he was involved with the Swedish church for a while before he came to Bristol. His runic inscription is actually in the rose window in Bristol Cathedral.
Right, okay.
And we've got all Breckenridge's research about that there. And here we have it on display. It's fantastic.
So Breckenridge, 1820s antiquarian of Bristol, collected a huge amount of material on Bristol's history, so many different aspects. And his son donated much of his collection to the city. That's how it's ended up here in Bristol Library. It's a fantastic resource of so much ephemera that would otherwise have been lost, papers, prints, and all sorts of really interesting things. So it's fantastic you've been able to include some of that in the display.
Well, it's only thanks to the librarians here. I didn't even know it was here, but because we were talking about it, up it popped, and we're just so lucky, really. We've got dedicated people who can present this sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. So back to Gulliver. You've talked about why now, obviously the anniversary of the book. That's a fantastic opportunity for the Bristol Radical History Group and Long John Silver Trust to, work with us to share some of our items in our collection and tell the story of Gulliver and its broader context. We've talked a little bit about its place in history, the context Swift was writing in, the issues that he was addressing. What is its relevance today, would you say, for a modern reader? What would they get out of reading Swift and understanding more about the context in which it was written?
I think they'll draw parallels with what happened in the 1720s with what's happening in the 2020s. As I said, that Gulliver's Travels came about after the backdrop of the War of the Spanish Succession. And now we've got the Ukraine war and what's happening in the Middle East. And a lot of people on the side making a lot of money out of this, sort of under the radar, and it's exactly the same as what happened in the 1720s. Britain's first and de facto Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, he absolutely made a killing out of his patronage and getting his family involved with various schemes off the back of the government. And he even went to Parliament and said, well, you've got to have a little bit of corruption, otherwise things just won't happen. And in a recent Financial Times report, they actually drew parallels between Walpole and the present administration in the White House.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So it really is relevant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Mark, thank you so much. It's been such a fantastic chat. So much context to the exhibit, so much context to Jonathan Swift's work and Gulliver's travels. It's been absolutely brilliant. The exhibit is going to be up at Bristol Central Library until Sunday the 27th of September, so everyone listening to this has plenty of opportunity to come along and see it themselves, learn more about Swift's work and Gulliver's travels and the Bristol connections to all of this. And then we also, I believe, we have a talk as well on Thursday the 10th of September at 12:30, where
yeah, I'll be doing a lunchtime lecture.
yeah, on Thursday the 10th of September at 12:30, you'll be coming in and giving us all of the information, and we're really looking forward to that as well. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for all this. Has been brilliant. Thank you.